"Mom, you're old now. I'll find you a caregiver." Daniel said it so casually, like he was reminding me to take my vitamins, like it was something small, something reasonable, something any loving son would say. And for a moment I just sat there at the dining table, my hands folded neatly beside my plate, the steam from my tea curling into the quiet space between us as if it too was trying to disappear before the words fully settled in. And I remember noticing the way Vanessa didn't look surprised. Not even a flicker, just that faint, satisfied softness at the corners of her mouth as she reached for her glass of water, as if this conversation had already happened somewhere else, sometime earlier without me, and I nodded because that was what they expected, because arguing would have made me look exactly like what they had already decided I was becoming, and I said, "If you think that's best," in the same calm voice I used when Daniel was a boy and came to me with scraped knees or broken toys. But this time he didn't look relieved, he looked efficient, like a problem had just been scheduled for resolution. And the room felt different after that, not louder or colder, just arranged, like I was no longer sitting in my own kitchen but in a place where decisions about me were being made with polite smiles and careful words. And Vanessa leaned forward slightly, her tone gentle in a way that didn't reach her eyes. "It's just for your safety, Eleanor. We worry about you being here alone." And I followed her gaze across the room to the hallway where the light from the afternoon sun stretched across the hardwood floor. And for a second I could almost see Thomas standing there the way he used to, one hand in his pocket, watching everything quietly, the way he always did when something wasn't quite right. And I wondered what he would say if he were here now, if he would recognize the shift that had happened so smoothly I almost missed it, the moment I stopped being the center of this home and became something to be managed. And Daniel started talking again about schedules and agencies and background checks, words that sounded responsible, reassuring, practical, each one placed carefully like stepping stones leading somewhere I hadn't agreed to go. And I listened, really listened, not just to what he said but to what he didn't say, because there was no question in his voice, no pause waiting for my answer, just a steady forward motion as if the decision had already been signed and filed and all that remained was for me to cooperate. And I felt something shift inside me then, not anger, not yet, just a quiet awareness, like opening a window and realizing the air outside smells different than it used to. And I took a small sip of my tea, letting the warmth settle in my chest, steadying my hands, because I knew better than to react too quickly. Thomas used to say that the most dangerous moments are the ones that feel polite, the ones where no one raises their voice, where everything sounds reasonable, because that's where you lose the most without realizing it. And Vanessa reached over and lightly touched Daniel's arm, a gesture so brief it might have meant nothing to anyone else. But I saw the way he glanced at her before continuing, as if checking he was saying the right things, as if this was a conversation they had rehearsed together. And that was when I understood this wasn't about my safety, not really, this was about control, about access, about slowly repositioning me in my own life until I was standing somewhere off to the side, grateful for decisions I hadn't made. And I set my cup down carefully, aligning it with the edge of the saucer the way I always did, small habits that made the world feel orderly, predictable, mine. And I smiled because that was what they expected too, the quiet, agreeable mother who didn't make things complicated. And I said, "All right, Daniel, if you've already found someone, we can try it." And Vanessa's shoulders relaxed just enough for me to notice, just enough to confirm what I had begun to suspect. And Daniel nodded, relieved now, not because I would be safer, but because I had made it easy for him. And the conversation moved on to other things, dinner, plans, errands, ordinary details that filled the space where something important had just been taken from me without a single raised voice. And as they spoke, I looked around my kitchen, at the cabinets Thomas built with his own hands, at the window above the sink where the light always came in just right in the late afternoon, at the chair across from me that had been empty for months now. And I realized that agreeing had not made me smaller the way they thought it would. It had simply given me time. And sometimes time is the only thing you need to understand exactly what game you've been invited to play, and more importantly, how you're going to win it. I did not notice the silence at first because grief has a way of softening everything, wrapping even the sharpest changes in something that feels almost gentle, almost understandable. But over the next few days, the house began to feel different in ways I could not ignore, not because anything obvious had changed, but because everything small had shifted just enough to make me feel like a guest in a place that had once known me completely. And it started the morning Rachel arrived, right at 9 o'clock, exactly when Daniel said she would. Her car pulling into the driveway with the kind of quiet precision that suggested she had done this many times before. And when I opened the door, she smiled warmly, introducing herself in a tone that was practiced but not unkind. holding a folder against her chest as if it contained everything she needed to understand me, and perhaps it did, because within the first hour she knew what time I usually had breakfast, what medications I took, how many steps it was from the kitchen to the back porch, and I watched her write things down in neat, careful lines, each detail captured, organized, stored, and I found myself wondering who those notes were truly for, because it was not me. And Daniel stopped by that afternoon, earlier than usual, standing in the doorway with that same efficient expression, asking Rachel how things were going before he asked me, and she answered in a calm, professional voice, describing my routine as if I were not sitting right there, as if I were a case rather than a person, and I smiled again because that was what I did now. I smiled and listened and let them speak because there is a kind of power in being underestimated, and I could feel it beginning to settle around me like a quiet shield. And over the next few days the changes continued, subtle but steady. Rachel began opening the mail before handing it to me, explaining that it was easier to sort things that way, and Daniel called more often, not to talk but to check, asking if I had taken my medication, if I had eaten lunch, if I had remembered to rest, questions that sounded like care but felt like monitoring. And Vanessa texted Rachel directly. I saw it once when her phone lit up on the counter, my name mentioned in a message that ended with a simple question mark, and Rachel typed back quickly, her fingers moving with a familiarity that told me this was not new, not unexpected, and I began to notice the rhythm of it all, the way information moved from me to Rachel and from Rachel to them, a quiet current running beneath the surface of my daily life, carrying pieces of me away in small manageable portions, and the house itself seemed to adjust around this new arrangement, the ticking clock in the hallway louder than before, the hum of the refrigerator more constant, the familiar sounds now layered with something else, something watchful, and I found myself moving differently, more aware of where I placed things, of what I said, of how I said it, not out of fear but out of curiosity, because I wanted to see how far this would go, how much they believed I could not see. And Rachel was careful, I will give her that. She never crossed a line that could be clearly pointed to, never said anything that could be called disrespectful, but there was a distance in the way she spoke to me, a slight pause before certain words, as if she were measuring not just what she said, but how it might be reported later, and I began to test that distance in small ways, leaving a book open to a page I had already read, moving a glass from one room to another and watching to see if it was returned to its original place, mentioning a mild headache in passing and noting how quickly it became a topic in Daniel's next phone call. And each time the pattern held, information traveled faster than it should have. Details reached places they had no reason to go. And I did not confront it, not yet, because confrontation would have closed the door before I understood what was behind it, and instead I leaned into the role they had chosen for me, the agreeable, slightly forgetful woman who needed help with things she had managed perfectly well for decades. And I let Rachel guide me through routines I already knew, nodding as she explained steps I could perform in my sleep, allowing Daniel to feel reassured, allowing Vanessa to feel in control, and all the while, I watched, I listened, I paid attention to the spaces between their words, to the moments when their certainty slipped just enough to reveal what they were really thinking. And it was in one of those moments, late in the afternoon as the sunlight stretched across the living room floor, that I realized this was not about making my life easier. It was about making it predictable, measurable, and eventually manageable without me. And I sat there in my own home, hands resting quietly in my lap, and understood that what they were building was not support, it was a system, and systems do not exist to care, they exist to control. And once I saw that clearly, everything else began to fall into place. I began to understand them best when I stopped listening to what they said and started paying attention to what they needed me to believe, because every suggestion now came wrapped in concern. Every decision softened with phrases that made it sound like I was still in control, and yet nothing actually waited for my approval anymore. And it was Daniel who showed it first, not in anything dramatic, but in the way he started speaking around me instead of to me, standing in the kitchen with Rachel, discussing my schedule as if I were a meeting that needed to be managed. She should not be going up and down the stairs too much, he said one afternoon, his voice low but not low enough, and Rachel nodded, writing it down, and I stood there holding a dish towel, listening to my own life being reduced to bullet points, and when I spoke, gently, calmly, reminding him that I had used those stairs every day for over 30 years, he smiled in that patient way that adults use with children. We just want to make things easier for you, Mom. And there it was again, that word easier. As if ease was something I had been missing all this time. As if the life I built had been too complicated for me to handle. And Vanessa reinforced it in quieter ways, sending over small changes that appeared thoughtful on the surface, replacing my regular grocery items with softer foods, suggesting I switch to slippers with more grip, asking Rachel to move certain things within reach so I would not have to stretch or bend, and each change made sense on its own. But together they began to reshape the house, lowering everything, simplifying everything, turning a place that had once responded to me into one that anticipated a version of me that could not quite keep up. And I let it happen because stopping it too soon would have told them I was still fully aware, and I needed them to believe otherwise, and Rachel played her role carefully, always polite, always attentive, but increasingly confident in her authority, reminding me of appointments I had not forgotten, offering help before I asked for it, correcting small details with a softness that made it difficult to object without seeming unreasonable. And I noticed the way she began to check things without telling me, opening drawers, glancing at paperwork, straightening stacks of mail that I had already arranged, as if she were not just assisting but verifying, and it was during one of those quiet afternoons that the pattern finally revealed itself clearly enough that I could not ignore it. I had mentioned, almost casually, that I felt a little tired after lunch, nothing unusual, just the kind of thing anyone might say, and within an hour Daniel called, his voice edged with concern, asking if I had taken my medication properly, if I had been feeling dizzy, if I thought I should schedule an extra appointment, and I answered calmly, telling him I was fine, but I watched Rachel from across the room as she avoided my eyes, focusing instead on wiping down the counter that did not need cleaning, and that was when I knew for certain that nothing I said remained with me, that every small detail was being collected, interpreted, and passed along, and I began to see the structure of it, not just the actions but the intention behind them. They were building a record, a quiet accumulation of observations that could be used to define me in ways I did not choose, and once that record was complete, it would speak louder than anything I could say. And I remembered something Thomas once told me, late one evening when we were going through paperwork together. If someone ever tries to organize your life for you, Eleanor, make sure you are the one holding the final version. And at the time it had seemed like practical advice, something about keeping documents in order. But now it felt like a warning I had not fully understood until this moment, and I realized that what they were doing was not rushed, not careless. It was deliberate, patient, designed to look like help while quietly shifting control away from me piece by piece. And I sat there, listening to the steady hum of the house, feeling the weight of their plan settling into something solid and real, and instead of resisting it I adjusted myself within it, because there is a difference between being caught in something and stepping into it with your eyes open, and I chose the second, letting my shoulders relax, letting my voice soften just a little more, allowing them to believe that their version of me was becoming true, while inside, I began to trace every line they had drawn, every step they had taken, until I could see exactly where it was all leading and exactly where it could be undone. The first time I opened Thomas's study again, I did it slowly, not because I was afraid of what I might find, but because I needed to remember how the room used to feel before it became something else, and the air inside was still the same, faintly carrying the scent of old paper and the cedar polish he insisted on using for his desk, and for a moment I stood there without moving, letting the quiet settle around me in a way that felt familiar, honest, untouched by the careful adjustments happening in the rest of the house. And I realized that this was the one place they had not yet reorganized, not yet softened or simplified or measured, perhaps because it still belonged too clearly to him, and they had not found a way to explain changing it without raising questions. And I closed the door gently behind me, not locking it, just enough to create a small boundary that felt entirely my own, and I walked to the desk, running my fingers lightly across its surface, remembering the evenings we spent there together, going over documents, bills, small notes about the house, the way he always insisted that I understand everything, not because he expected something to happen, but because he believed that knowing was its own kind of protection. And I opened the top drawer first, the one that held ordinary things, pens, envelopes, a few receipts, all exactly where he left them, and then I moved to the lower drawer, the one he used less often, the one he once told me was for the things that matter when everything else gets complicated. And I paused there for a second, feeling the weight of that sentence in a way I had not before, and when I pulled it open the sound was soft but final, like a decision being made, and inside were folders neatly labeled in his careful handwriting, each one precise, intentional, and I sat down in his chair, the leather still creasing in the same places it always had, and began to go through them one by one, not rushing, not searching wildly, just reading, understanding, letting each piece settle into place. And it did not take long for the pattern to emerge, because Thomas had always been thorough. There were copies of property records, insurance policies, bank authorizations, all organized in a way that made it clear he expected them to be used, not just stored. And then I found the envelope slightly thicker than the others, with my name written on the front in a way that felt both familiar and deliberate, and I held it for a moment before opening it, not out of hesitation, but out of respect for the man who had taken the time to prepare something he hoped I would never need. And inside was a letter, his handwriting steady as always, and as I read, his voice came back to me in a way that was almost unsettling in its clarity. He had written about possibilities, not accusations, about how situations can change after someone is gone, how intentions can be misunderstood or reshaped by others, and he had outlined carefully what he had put in place to ensure that I would always retain control over the house, the accounts, the decisions that mattered, not by making it difficult for anyone else, but by making it clear where the authority rested. And there were documents attached, legal copies, instructions, names of people I could trust if I ever needed to confirm anything. And I felt something inside me steady in a way it had not since that dinner. Not relief exactly, but clarity, the kind that removes doubt and replaces it with something quieter, more certain. And I sat there for a long time, the afternoon light shifting across the desk, the sounds of the house continuing outside the closed door, Rachel moving in the kitchen, the faint vibration of a phone somewhere in the hallway, all of it continuing as if nothing had changed, and yet everything had, because now I understood not just what they were doing, but what they believed they would be able to do, and more importantly, what they would not be able to do at all. And I folded the letter carefully, placing it back in the envelope, not hiding it, not locking it away, just returning it to where it belonged, because I did not need to protect it from them. I only needed to know that it existed, and I stood up, smoothing my hand over the desk one last time, a small gesture that felt like a promise to the life we had built together. And when I opened the door and stepped back into the house, I carried myself a little differently, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for me to feel the shift. Because I was no longer trying to understand what was happening. To me, I was beginning to understand how it would end. The next morning, I did something I had not done in a long time. I let myself sleep in, not because I was tired, but because I wanted to see what would happen if I did not follow the quiet structure they had begun to build around me. And when I finally walked into the kitchen, Rachel was already there, standing by the counter with a look that was almost but not quite concern. "I was about to check on you," she said, her voice soft, measured. And I smiled as I poured myself a cup of coffee, noticing the way she glanced at the clock before looking back at me, as if marking the deviation, as if this small change needed to be recorded somewhere. And I moved through the morning slowly, deliberately, choosing my own pace, opening the back door to let in the cool air, stepping outside onto the porch without announcing it, feeling the wooden boards beneath my feet, grounding myself in something that still belonged entirely to me. And for a few minutes there was no system, no observation, just the quiet rhythm of a house that remembered me. And when I came back inside, Rachel was on her phone, her voice low but not low enough. "She woke up later today around 9:30, she said, turning slightly away as she spoke, and I did not stop, did not react, just walked past her as if I had heard nothing, because sometimes the most revealing moments are the ones you pretend not to notice. And throughout the day I continued in that same gentle way, making small choices that did not fit the version of me they were expecting, moving a chair back to its original place after it had been repositioned for safety, reaching for a glass on the higher shelf instead of the one placed conveniently within reach, reading the mail before Rachel could sort it, each action quiet, reasonable, difficult to question without exposing the intention behind the correction. And I could feel the tension building, not openly, not in anything that could be named, but in the slight hesitation before Rachel spoke, in the longer pauses before she wrote something down, in the way Daniel's voice carried a new note of uncertainty during his evening call. "Everything okay today?" he asked, and I answered simply, "Yes, everything is fine," letting the words settle without offering anything more, and there was a silence on the other end that told me he was listening for something I was not giving him. And that was when I understood that control does not like unpredictability, it depends on patterns, on repetition, on the quiet assurance that tomorrow will look like today. And I had begun to disrupt that without ever raising my voice, without ever refusing anything directly. And it made them cautious in a way I had not seen before. And later that evening, as I sat in the living room with a book open in my lap, I noticed Rachel watching me, not in the open but in that careful peripheral way that suggested she was trying to reconcile what she saw with what she had been told to expect. And I let her look, turning a page slowly, pausing as if I had lost my place, then continuing without asking for help, and it was a small thing, almost nothing, but I could see the shift in her posture, the slight adjustment as she reconsidered something she thought she understood. And it was in that moment that I realized something important. They had built their plan on an assumption, not a fact, and assumptions are fragile. They require constant reinforcement, constant confirmation, and if that confirmation stops coming even briefly, the entire structure begins to question itself. And I stood up then, closing my book, and walked toward the hallway, passing the study without slowing, because I did not need to go in there again, not yet. What I needed now was patience, the kind that allows you to let others reveal themselves fully before you decide how to respond. And as I turned off the light in the living room, I caught my reflection in the window, the outline of a woman standing quietly in her own home, and for the first time in weeks I did not look smaller. I looked still, centered, like someone who had stopped reacting and started choosing. And that was a difference they would not recognize until it was far too late. It was on the third day after I stopped following their quiet routine that Daniel came by earlier than usual, not with the relaxed confidence he had carried before, but with something more careful, more measured, as if he were stepping into a situation he no longer fully understood, and I could see it in the way he paused just inside the doorway, his eyes moving briefly from me to Rachel and back again, searching for confirmation that everything was still where he had left it. And I greeted him the same way I always had, calm, warm, offering him a seat at the kitchen table, pouring him a cup of coffee without asking if he wanted one, because I already knew he would say yes, and for a moment the familiarity seemed to unsettle him more than anything else, as if the absence of visible decline did not fit into whatever framework he had built in his mind. And he cleared his throat, glancing toward Rachel. "How has she been today?" he asked, not looking at me when he said it, and Rachel hesitated just slightly before answering. "She has been doing well, a little more independent than expected," and there was something in the way she chose those words that made the air between them shift, because more independent was not the outcome they had planned for. And I sat there quietly, stirring my coffee even though it did not need stirring, letting the silence stretch just enough for the weight of that sentence to settle. And Daniel nodded slowly, but I could see the calculation behind it, the adjustment, the beginning of a new approach forming in real time. And he turned to me then, finally, his smile returning but not quite reaching his eyes. "That is good, Mom, but you should not push yourself too much. We just want to make sure you are comfortable." And I met his gaze steadily, not challenging, not defensive, just present. "I am comfortable, Daniel," I said, and for a moment, he did not respond, as if the simplicity of that statement left him without a prepared answer. And Vanessa arrived shortly after, her entrance light, almost cheerful, carrying a small bag of groceries that she set on the counter with a practiced ease. "I brought you some things that are easier to prepare," she said, unpacking items that I had not asked for, placing them neatly within reach, adjusting the space once again, and I watched her hands as she moved, efficient, precise, confident in the assumption that these changes would remain, and I let her finish before speaking. "Thank you, Vanessa," I said, my voice soft, appreciative, and then just as gently, I moved one of the items back to its original place, not rejecting it, just restoring the balance. And she paused, her fingers lingering on the counter for a second longer than necessary, her eyes flicking to Daniel as if to confirm whether this was something to address. And he gave the smallest shake of his head, a signal so subtle it might have been missed by anyone not watching closely. But I saw it, and in that moment I understood that they were no longer entirely certain of their position, that the quiet certainty they had relied on was beginning to fracture, not dramatically, not in a way that could be named, but in the small, accumulating ways that make control difficult to maintain. And the conversation moved forward, touching on ordinary things, the weather, a neighbor who had recently moved, a brief mention of a doctor's appointment that Vanessa suggested rescheduling just to be safe. And I listened, responding when necessary, allowing the surface of the interaction to remain smooth, while beneath it, I observed every shift, every glance, every hesitation, and it became clear that they were testing new boundaries now, introducing suggestions more carefully, watching how I responded, measuring not just my actions but my reactions to their adjustments. And Rachel, for her part, seemed caught between two roles, her professionalism guiding her to report accurately, her understanding of the situation urging her to align with their expectations, and that tension showed in the way she moved, slightly less certain, slightly more cautious. And I realized then that the system they had built was not as stable as it appeared. It relied on consistency, on predictable behavior, on a version of me that no longer existed, and without that, every part of it required constant recalibration, constant attention, and that made it vulnerable. And I stood up after a while, excusing myself to the living room, leaving them in the kitchen together, their voices lowering as soon as I stepped out of sight, and I did not need to hear what they were saying to know the nature of the conversation, because I had already seen the beginning of it, the uncertainty, the questions forming where there had once been assumptions, and I sat down by the window, the late afternoon light casting long shadows across the floor, and I allowed myself a small, private moment of stillness, not as a retreat, but as a confirmation, because everything was unfolding exactly as it needed to, not through confrontation, not through resistance, but through the simple act of not becoming what they expected me to be. And sometimes that is all it takes to change the direction of a story that others thought they had already written for you. It happened in a moment so ordinary that it almost slipped past me, the kind of moment that would have meant nothing if I had not already been paying attention to everything, and it was late in the afternoon when Rachel stepped outside to take a call, leaving her phone on the kitchen counter for just a second longer than she intended, the screen lighting up with a message that appeared before she could reach it, and I did not move right away, I did not rush or lean forward. I simply let my eyes rest there as if I were glancing at nothing in particular, and the name at the top of the message was Vanessa, followed by a short line that said, "Make sure you note everything today, especially her confusion this morning." And I felt something inside me go very still, not shocked, not surprised, just confirmed, as if a quiet question I had been holding had finally been answered in the simplest possible way. And when Rachel came back inside, her expression unchanged, her voice steady, I met her eyes briefly and smiled the same small, polite smile I had been using all week, because there was no reason to show her that anything had shifted, not yet, and the rest of the evening unfolded as it always did, dinner prepared, dishes cleared, small conversations that sounded normal on the surface but now carried a different weight, because I could hear what was missing from them, the honesty, the directness, the simple acknowledgement that I was still present in my own life, and instead there was this careful narrative being built around me, one that described me as slightly forgetful, slightly uncertain, just enough to justify the decisions they were preparing to make, and I played my part in it just as carefully, letting a pause linger a second longer than necessary when I answered a question, asking Rachel to repeat something once, not because I needed her to, but because I wanted to see how quickly that detail would travel, and it did, of course it did, because later that evening Daniel called again, his tone edged with something he was trying to hide. "Rachel mentioned you seemed a little confused earlier," he said, and I could almost hear Vanessa in the background, not speaking but listening, and I responded gently, "I was just thinking about something, Daniel, you know how that goes." And there was a brief silence, the kind that forms when someone expects a different answer and does not quite know what to do with the one they receive, and I let it sit there, unanswered, unresolved, because uncertainty has a way of making people reveal more than certainty ever could, and over the next day, I continued in that same quiet, deliberate way, offering them just enough of what they expected to keep their narrative intact, while holding back the parts of myself that did not fit into it, and I began to notice how quickly they adjusted, how each small detail was absorbed, interpreted, and added to the story they were constructing, and it became clear that this was not just observation, it was preparation. They were gathering something, building toward a moment where all of these notes, these small recorded instances, would be presented as evidence of a larger truth, one that I had never agreed to, and I thought of Thomas again, of the letter in the drawer, of the way he had written about clarity, about understanding not just what is happening, but why it is happening, and I realized that I was no longer trying to figure out their intentions. I already knew them. What I needed now was to understand their timing, their end point, the moment they believed everything would be in place, and that realization brought with it a kind of calm that I had not felt since before all of this began. Because once you know the direction of something, you can begin to choose how you will meet it, and that evening, as I sat in the living room with the soft light from the lamp casting a warm glow across the walls, I allowed myself to close my eyes for a moment, not in exhaustion but in quiet focus, and I could almost see it, the shape of what they were building, the assumptions they were relying on, the confidence they believed they had, and I understood with a certainty that settled deep and steady within me, that they had made one critical mistake. They had mistaken my silence for absence, and in doing so they had forgotten that I was still here, still watching, still capable of deciding exactly how this would unfold. And when I opened my eyes again, the room looked the same, the house sounded the same, but nothing felt the same, because now I was no longer inside their story. I was standing just outside of it, seeing it clearly for what it was and preparing for the moment when I would step back in on my own terms. The call to Mr. Howard Bennett was the only part of this that I did not allow to happen inside the house, not because I was afraid of being overheard, but because some conversations deserve a space that has not been quietly rearranged by other people's intentions, and I chose a small bench at the far end of the park 2 blocks away, the one Thomas and I used to sit on in the early evenings, where the sound of passing cars faded just enough to make room for clear thinking. And when Mr. Bennet answered, his voice carried the same steady professionalism I remembered, unchanged by time or circumstance. "Eleanor, it has been a while," he said, and I could hear the slight shift in his tone when I explained why I was calling. Not alarm, not urgency, just attention, the kind that sharpens when something important is being said. And I did not rush through it, I did not dramatize or accuse. I simply described what had been happening, the caregiver, the notes, the calls, the quiet adjustments that had begun to redefine my life without ever asking for my agreement. And when I finished, there was a brief pause, not empty but thoughtful, and then he spoke, carefully, precisely. "Have you signed anything recently, Eleanor, anything that grants access or authority?" And I answered truthfully, "No, I have not." And I could almost hear him nod on the other end. "Good," he said. "That gives us room." And there was something in those words that settled firmly into place, not relief, but confirmation that I was not too late, that whatever they were building had not yet reached the point where it could no longer be redirected. And we spoke for nearly an hour, going through the documents Thomas had left, confirming what I already suspected, that the authority remained where it was meant to remain, that any attempt to shift it would require more than quiet observation and careful suggestion. It would require my explicit consent or clear evidence that I was no longer capable of making decisions, and as he explained this, I understood the structure of their plan more clearly than ever. They were not trying to take control directly, not yet. They were preparing to justify it, building a case that could be presented as concern, as necessity, as protection, and once that case was strong enough, they would move forward with the confidence that they were acting in my best interest. And I thanked him, not with urgency, but with a calm acknowledgement of what he had given me, clarity, direction, and a quiet assurance that I still held more power than they believed. And when I ended the call, I sat there for a few minutes longer, watching the late afternoon light shift across the grass, feeling the weight of everything settle into something steady and manageable. And when I returned home, nothing had visibly changed. Rachel was in the kitchen, the house was as orderly as ever, the same soft routines unfolding in the same predictable way. And I stepped back into it as if I had never left, greeting her, moving through the space with the same measured calm. But now there was a difference in how I carried myself, not something she could see, but something that shaped every choice I made, every word I spoke, because I was no longer observing their plan from within it, I was moving alongside it, understanding where it would turn before it did. And that evening when Daniel called, his voice carrying that familiar note of careful concern, I responded exactly as he expected, offering nothing that would disrupt the narrative they were building, because disruption too early would only force them to adjust more quickly. And what I needed was time for them to continue, time for them to believe that everything was proceeding as planned. And over the next few days I began to prepare in ways that did not draw attention, reviewing the documents again, organizing what I would need, noting the details that would matter when the moment came. And I did not rush, because rushing belongs to those who are reacting. And I was no longer reacting, I was choosing, and I could feel the quiet tension in the house increasing, not because anything had been said, but because something unspoken was beginning to shift. The small hesitations, the longer glances, the subtle recalculations in the way Daniel and Vanessa spoke to me, all of it pointing toward a moment they believed was approaching. And I allowed them to believe it, because sometimes the most effective way to change the outcome of something is to let it reach the point where it believes it has already succeeded. And as I sat at the kitchen table that night, the soft light above casting a familiar glow across the surface, I placed my hands calmly in front of me and understood that everything was nearly in place, not for them but for me, and that when the moment arrived it would not be loud, it would not be dramatic, it would be simple, precise, and final in a way they would not be able to ignore. They chose a Sunday evening for it, which I found almost thoughtful in a way that would have been touching if I did not already understand the intention behind it. Because Sunday dinners had always been a tradition in this house, something steady, something familiar, something that once meant connection rather than quiet negotiation. And Vanessa arrived first, carrying a dessert she placed carefully on the counter as if she were setting the stage for something pleasant, something normal, and Daniel followed shortly after, his expression composed but just tight enough around the edges to suggest that this was not an ordinary visit. And Rachel moved quietly in the background, more reserved than usual, as if she understood that her role in what was about to happen required her to be present but not central. and I greeted them all the same way I always had, calm, welcoming, setting the table with the same attention to detail I had practiced for years, because there is a kind of power in maintaining routine when others expect disruption, and we sat down together, the familiar clink of silverware against plates filling the space where something heavier waited to be spoken, and for a while the conversation stayed light, careful, moving from one safe topic to another, until Daniel finally set his fork down and looked at me, not with hesitation, but with the quiet determination of someone who believes they are about to do the right thing. "Mom," he began, his voice steady, rehearsed, "we have been thinking a lot about what is best for you moving forward." And I nodded slightly, encouraging him to continue, because this was the moment they had been building toward, the point where all of their careful observations, their notes, their quiet adjustments would be brought together into something that sounded reasonable, something that sounded necessary. And he reached into his bag, pulling out a folder that he placed on the table between us, his hand resting on it for just a second longer than needed, as if to anchor himself to the decision, and Vanessa leaned forward slightly, her expression soft, supportive. "It is just some paperwork," she said gently. "Nothing complicated, just to make things easier for you." And I looked at the folder without opening it, letting the silence stretch just enough to make them aware of it, and then I reached for my glasses, placing them carefully on my face before finally lifting the top page. And I did not need to read more than a few lines to understand exactly what it was, a request for limited financial oversight, framed as assistance, supported by documented observations of my supposed confusion, my supposed difficulty managing daily tasks, all of it presented in a way that made it sound like a natural next step. And I set the paper down again, my hand steady, my expression unchanged, and for a moment no one spoke because they were waiting for agreement, for hesitation, for any sign that would confirm the version of me they had been constructing. And I could feel Rachel watching quietly from the side, her presence a silent reinforcement of everything they had prepared. And I folded my hands in front of me, just as I had done so many times before, and I spoke, not loudly, not sharply, but with a clarity that carried more weight than anything I could have said in anger. "I see," I said, and Daniel leaned forward slightly, relief already beginning to form, but I did not let him finish that thought, because I reached beside me and picked up my own folder, the one I had prepared, the one that had been waiting for this exact moment, and I placed it gently on top of theirs, the soft sound of paper meeting paper cutting through the room more effectively than any raised voice, and I opened it, turning it toward them, and I watched as their expressions shifted, not all at once but in small, precise stages, confusion first, then recognition, and finally something else, something closer to understanding, as they read through the documents that confirmed what they had overlooked, that the authority they were attempting to access had already been secured, clarified, and protected in ways they could not easily change, that any attempt to redefine my capacity would require more than quiet observation and careful suggestion. It would require proof they did not have and consent I was not giving. And I let them read, I let the silence do its work, because there are moments when words only weaken what is already clear, and when Daniel finally looked up at me, his expression no longer certain, no longer composed, I met his gaze with the same calm steadiness I had carried throughout all of this, and I said, "You should have asked me, Daniel." Not as an accusation, not as a reprimand, but as a simple statement of fact. And Vanessa sat back slightly, her hands no longer moving, her confidence interrupted in a way she had not prepared for, and Rachel lowered her eyes, her role in this suddenly less defined, and I closed the folder, not abruptly, just enough to signal that the conversation, as they had intended it, was over, and I stood up, smoothing my hand lightly across the table, a familiar gesture that now carried a different meaning, and I added quietly, "I am not something that needs to be managed." And then I turned and walked toward the living room, not waiting for a response, not needing one, because everything that mattered had already been said, not in volume but in certainty, and behind me I could feel the shift, the quiet unraveling of a plan that had depended on my silence meaning something it never did. And, for the first time since this began, the house felt like mine again, not because anything had been taken back, but because nothing had been given away.